Welcome to the July 14th update of the analysis of the IHME COVID-19 forecasting model. This work is done in conjunction with Jonathan Featherstone and Julia Maddock. I am Alan Featherstone. There's been one revision to the IHME model since July 7th, and we will give a little bit of discussion of that. Next, we'll take a look at the projected death through August 4th. We're going to look at the infections. Certainly that has been in the news recently. Then we're going to look at the trend in death totals. Then we'll look at the distribution of daily death compared to the March 26 model. We're also going to, like we did last time, focus on the 8 persons per million switch point. That is when IHME argues that government should throttle down their economy at that point once you reach 8 persons per million deaths per day. And then we'll finish up with the cumulative death total compared to the March 26 model. The modeling of focus and has not changed much over the last week. Certainly the coronavirus is having a major effect on the U.S. economy with an unemployment rate of about 11%. Since the middle of March, nearly 50 million U.S. workers have filed for unemployment due to a shutdown of a significant share of the economy. The data used in this analysis is from the Health Metrics and Evaluation Center at the University of Washington. In terms of the actual death information is from the COVID tracking project, covidtracking.com, and this is an update of the July 7th model. In terms of the approach, really nothing has changed since last week. Again, the revised model is basically just looking at adding additional observations in the expectations. It is important to realize that the paper is still in the peer review process, and so it is going through that process. What I've done here is looked at the last 3 versions of the model, the 624, the 629, and the 7/6 models. And then I compare that to the original, and so to give an indication, the original death total for Arizona was 1,613. The last 3 revisions had 3440, 3111, and then 3137. And so looking at this, you can kind of look at what's going on in terms of Kansas. The last 3 revisions have went from 341 to 343 to 366, but that's substantially below the original August 4th totals of 687. You can look at various states here to get a little bit of an indication. This last revision, the one that was released on 7/6, actually backed off in many states the projected death total. Certainly there have been states where it increased, but for example, and a lot of them, if you look at it, they're pretty small amounts one way or the other, and then especially if you look on a percentage basis. The U.S. as a whole, the original model was 82,000. In terms of that, is now through 7/6, and again, this is the August 4th death total is 148,934, and so in the last revision of the model, roughly about 1,250 additional deaths were forecast. And so to summarize the last 3 slides here a little bit, the model revision on July 6th basically increased the cumulative expected death in 22 states from the July 29th model. And you do have a listing of the states, and some of those are very small, maybe a death increase of 3 or 4, but some of them are more substantial with that regards. If you can compare that with the original model, essentially with the cumulative expected death, roughly 25 states have a higher cumulative expected death, and 25 states have a lower cumulative expected death. And so it's right in the middle there with regards to looking at that. And you do have the states that essentially the projection now is higher than the original one. One of the things you'll see is Kansas isn't on that, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Missouri is, Colorado isn't, and so certainly some of the surrounding states with regards to Kansas looks at that. The next slide, we have basically looked at the cases in terms of the percent of the population, and so we take the total of cases divided by the population to give a percent. In terms of the way the color code is if it's red, it's greater than 1%, and if it's green, it's less than 1%. The U.S. is 1.07%. Last week it was less than 1%, but essentially the red is greater than 1%, the green is less than 1%. And so you can see, for example, Alabama basically went from 0.93 to 1.16. Kansas went from 0.58% of the population to 0.69% of the population. And so you can get a little bit of an idea there with regards to how that has changed over the last 7 days. Certainly in terms of Arizona, it's had a jump. That's one of the states in the news. Georgia's another one that's in the news. In terms of South Carolina, basically went from 0.92 to 1.17. In terms of another state in the news is Texas. In terms of Texas is just a little bit below that. In terms of maybe to summarize this, the infection rate as of July 6th was 0.93%, so basically a little less than 1 in 100 individuals in the U.S. Have been infected by the coronavirus, at least documented. In terms of that now is 1.07, and so we went up from a little bit below to a little bit above of the population. The range, New York, roughly 1 in 50 people, a little less than that, have been infected in New York. In terms of Hawaii, it's less than 1,000, and so certainly a wide range, and you can see that on the previous slides. 17 states have an infection rate greater than 1%. 3 states basically cross that from being less than 1% to greater than 1%. 33 states have an infection rate of less, and so certainly the number of infections has increased quite a bit over the last week. The next thing what we're going to do is basically look at a trend analysis. We started doing this a couple weeks ago. The first period of trend is looking at the month of June, so it's essentially 6/1 through 6/29. The second trend analysis, basically I keep the same number of observations, 30 observations, and we look at the death from 6/15 to 7/14 to look at changes in trends. And so obviously as numbers become less negative, it basically means that the situation is not improving. And so, for example, Alabama went from 0.01, a positive trend, to 0.15. And so again, if you would multiply it by 30, that would give you a little bit of an idea over a month time in terms of what's occurring with regards to the rate of death. There have been some states that have increased. New Jersey, again, a lot of that is just from a reporting aspect, and we'll see that very clearly when we look at the graphs. We talked about that previously. For example, Nebraska went from a flat trend to basically a reduction in the amount of death. And so if you look at the comparison of the month of June with the middle of June through the middle of July, you see that Nebraska is actually ending up in a better situation. Missouri's ending up in a better situation. Kansas is in a slightly worse position. Kentucky is in a worse position. Again, some of these changes may not be statistically significant, but they are the best estimate based on the data that is available. And so we'll finish up these, and so you can again take a look at these. In terms of some of the concerns is South Carolina. Certainly that's been in the news with regards to what's going on there. Texas has been in the news, and so you can see that Texas, the death rate trend from 1st of June to roughly the end of June was 0.33. From the middle of June to the middle of July, it's 2.06, and so certainly Texas has experienced a much worse situation. Florida is another one that is in the news, and so you can also see that Florida has went from just looking June alone to looking at the middle of June to the middle of July. You see a pretty big increase there. California is another state. Arizona is another state, and so you can see a pretty big increase there by essentially adding 2 weeks of data and deleting 2 weeks of data with regards to a worsening situation with regards to the trend. And so to maybe summarize this, essentially the U.S. experienced a 5.69 death decrease per day from June 1 to June 29. And eliminating the first 2 weeks and adding the most recent 2 weeks, essentially it's still a decrease, but it's less of a decrease. Essentially that rate has been cut in more than half. In terms of just comparing the month of June with the middle of June to middle of July, 9 states have seen a lowering in the trend of death. And so these 9 states, Alaska, Arkansas, Hawaii, Missouri, Nebraska, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Wisconsin have ended up in a better situation. Again, New Jersey, we need to be careful with that simply because of the way they reported data. And so that could be more of an artifact of one data point than a general trend. If we look at overall, since June 15th, the most recent trends, 26 states still have a decreasing in the daily death. This was down from 30. 22 states have an increase in daily death. This was up from 14. And then 2 states basically have a flat trend, at least if you take it to the hundreds of persons per day. And so certainly we can see that the reduction in death has slowed, and in some cases we're actually seeing an increase in death. In terms of 22 states, we're seeing an increase. And so certainly that's one of the metrics that people are very concerned about is the death rate. We're going to now look at each of the 50 states plus the U.S. in terms of, again, the pink line is essentially 8 deaths per million. This is where IHME would suggest that economic activity needs to begin to slow down at that point in time. The red line is essentially the actual reported deaths. That's from the COVID tracking project all the way across. And then the green line, the upper and lower bound, this is from the original March 26th projections. And then the purple line is the mean. And so essentially, again, just to review, 95% of the observations should be between the green lines. There should be a 2.5% probability that you'd be below the green line and 2.5% probability above the green line. In terms of looking at this, one of the things you'll see is that in terms of closing down the U.S. economy nationwide does not come close to the pink line. In terms of the pink line is up there at about 2,600, and essentially during the last week we were below 1,000. And so again, from the death perspective, the deaths do not warrant according to the IHME, shutting the economy. We're going to go through a number of these very quickly, and I will probably just highlight those where it's close to the 8 deaths per million. Certainly in Kansas, it's been less than 5 persons each day in July. Again, fairly flat situation. Colorado, again, you see a little bit of an increase here, but still it's quite a bit below the 8 per million. Again, Nebraska, a better situation, quite a bit of room there. Missouri, again, quite a bit below that economy shutdown. Oklahoma, again, in a pretty good situation. We then moved to New York. Again, New York is entering into a better situation as we progress in terms of essentially it would be all the way back to May when they were last close to that 8 per million deaths per day. New Jersey, again, this is where they went back and added a number of deaths. They just reported them in one day. These should be spread out in terms of some aspect here to increase that red line before that. Certainly this is going to enter our period of trend analysis from 6:1 to 6:30. It also enters 6:15 to 7. One of the things you are ending up seeing is early on it caused that trend line to be positive. Later on you're going to see that it causes it to be negative. And really, once we begin looking at the month of July, that we'll get a better measure of what's going on in New Jersey. Again, in the last week, they did have one day where they registered more than 8 deaths per million. Connecticut, doing pretty well. They did have a little bit of a jump up here. Massachusetts, Maryland, Delaware, all are below, but we see Rhode Island, they've had a couple spikes above, and so relatively they're doing worse off than some of their northeastern neighbors. New Hampshire seems to be doing pretty well. Vermont hasn't had a death for about 3 weeks. Maine continues to do well. Pennsylvania is doing pretty well from a death perspective. Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and so the upper Midwest certainly is quite a bit below that 8 deaths per million, and so certainly pulling back the economy there. If you do believe the 8 per million threshold, does not make a lot of sense. Florida, you do see that trending up, and that's kind of what's going on with the trend there. It's starting to approach that 8 per million. Georgia is quite a bit below. In terms of South Carolina, has kind of been up and down. In terms of it was fairly close, but then the amount of death did back off. North Carolina, Virginia quite a bit below, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama basically the most recent observation on 7/14 basically did cross that 8 per million deaths there, and so certainly Alabama is in a situation where economic activity might need to be pulled back with the death rate. Mississippi certainly is close. Louisiana is quite a bit below. Arkansas is quite a bit below. Texas is still quite a bit below, but certainly seeing an increasing trend there from death is disconcerting. New Mexico's been pretty flat. Arizona is another hot spot, and one of the things you will see, and especially in the last week, you'll see a number of observations where they did register more deaths than 8 per million of population. Utah's quite a bit below. Wyoming's quite a bit below. Montana's quite a bit below. North Dakota's quite a bit below. South Dakota did spike there, but again, it could be a reporting, the way they report their deaths. Idaho's quite a bit below. Nevada's quite a bit below. California is quite a bit below. Oregon is quite a bit below. Washington, Alaska, and Hawaii are all quite a bit below. And so looking at that, you do see a few states where the number of deaths is approaching that 8 per million threshold. But in a number of states, it is quite a bit below. The last thing we'll take a look at here is just the cumulative death in terms of this is update. And most of these graphs you can find on the agmanager.info. And so if you want to look at an individual state kind of updated in the last week, again, you can see U.S. If you look at that original projection on cumulative death, it's kind of between the upper and lower bound. It's above the mean and within the confidence interval. If you look at Kansas, Kansas is below the confidence interval, and so Kansas is kind of an outlier on the good side with a much less lower death expectation than what was originally projected. Missouri just crossed the mean, and so they're kind of above the mean, but within the confidence interval. New York is kind of an outlier on the other side, where they experienced a situation quite a bit worse than what was projected in the original model, and so that would be above the mean outside the confidence interval. And then Florida is kind of within the confidence interval and below the mean, and so again, from that original model, they're still quite a bit below. This kind of summarizes this for the other states, and again, you can take a look at that on agmanager.info. In terms of looking at this, 13 states are above the mean and above the 95% confidence interval, and so they've experienced a situation much worse than was projected back in March. 9 states are above the mean but within that 95% confidence interval, and this actually has increased with Missouri and a couple other states going above the mean from below the mean. 16 states are below the mean, but within the 95% confidence interval. Again, adding that up, essentially 25% are within the 95% confidence interval. 25% are outside the confidence interval, with 12 being low and 13 being high. And so, again, in terms of looking at this, essentially, we should have 95% in there, 2.5% and 2.5%. And so you can see that the experience has been much wider than the original predicted confidence interval. Again, 22 states are above in terms of 28 states are below. And so you're almost 50-50 in terms of whether or not you were above the mean or below the mean. To maybe conclude here, certainly the distribution of death by age group continues to be similar to the distribution of death from all causes. Those slides are available on the agmanager.info, and so if you want to take a look at those, I did update those from the previous presentations, but I'm not going to show them today. The U.S. COVID infection rate is 1.07% of the population, so roughly 1 out of 100 individuals has been affected by COVID and essentially had that positive test. The trend analysis basically since June 15th, essentially U.S. as a whole, the number of deaths is decreasing by 2.5 per day. And so if you multiply that by 30 days over that period of time, essentially the U.S. has reduced the number of deaths by roughly 75 deaths from the middle of June to the middle of July. Looking at this, essentially, if you use 8 deaths per million as an indicator for reduced economic activity, only 5 states are relatively close or above that metric in the last week: Alabama, Arizona, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. The other states are quite a bit below, and many of them substantially below that 8 deaths per million. And so certainly, if you accept that 8 deaths per million as the switch point for reduction of economic activity to be considered or to be implemented, there isn't a lot of justification in a number of states. Basically, you're looking just at 5 out of the 50 states. 26 states have had a decreasing trend for daily deaths since the middle of June. 22 have experienced an increasing trend. The other 2 have been flat. But again, the overall trend still is, and that's measured by that essentially the trend since the middle of June is for still a decreasing daily deaths. It's a little bit more even than it was the month of June, but it still is on that downward trend. And again, the U.S. cumulative death total through July 14th is above the mean, but it is within the 95% confidence band. Again, it's much easier to predict aggregate numbers than individual state numbers, and that's one of the things we've seen here is that the U.S. total is within the 95% confidence interval. But if you look at individual states, roughly half of them are within the confidence interval. And again, it just shows the difficulty with regards to estimating those confidence intervals, but also projecting very diverse states. With that, we appreciate your time. Next week we'll update again and basically look at what the U.S. is experiencing with the coronavirus. Have a good week.